Okay, everybody, are you ready? This is our little final reading. It's the conclusion of the three investigators in the mystery of the flaming footprints. I hope you've enjoyed it. We'll be doing an assignment this week. Okay, let's begin. Chapter 17 The Other Watchers. The Dobsons and the three investigators arranged themselves as comfortably as possible on the cellar stairs and listened as, above them, the bogus fishermen searched the potter's house. Drawers in the kitchen were pulled open, cupboard doors banged, footsteps hurried into the pantry, and cans tumbled to the floor. Walls were knocked. They heard Ferrier retreat from the kitchen and go down the hall to the potter's office. There was a heavy wrenching sound and a thud that shook dust around their ears. He's knocking over that filing cabinet, Pete decided. The potter's ancient desk was moved, screeching, a protest under the bare boards of the floors. Then again, there came the sounds of walls being thumped. Hey, did the police find the potter's secret library? Jupiter asked Tom. No, they didn't, Tom reported. You boys have been holding out on me, declared Eloise Dobson. What secret library? Nothing, Mom, said Tom. Just a bunch of old newspapers behind that eagle plaque in your room. Now why would anyone hide a bunch of old newspapers? Asked Mrs. Dobson. To give a searcher something to find, said Jupiter. There was a crash from overhead. Oh dear, said Mrs. Dobson. That must be the big vase in the hall. Oh, it's a pity, said Jupiter. Ferrier's steps crossed the hall and sounded heavily on the stairs. He must be the one that's planted all those flaming footprints, decided Mrs. Dobson suddenly. Undoubtedly, said Jupiter. He had the keys, and he could come and go as he pleased. He would have used the back door, I'm sure, since the front door had a slide bolt. And the footsteps, began Tom. Jupiter held up his hand suddenly. Listen. They were silent. After a moment, I don't hear anything, whispered Tom Dobson. Someone came up to that back porch, said Jupiter. They tried the door, and then they went down again. Oh, good. Said Heloise Dobson. Let's yell. Please don't, Miss Dobson, said Bob earnestly. You see, there isn't only this Ferrier creep. There's those other two real sinister types up on the hilltop house. The peeping Toms, said Miss Dobson. I'm afraid they're more than sinister than that, Jupiter informed her. They rented Hilltop House for a definite reason, because it overlooked this house. Jupiter motioned for silence. There were footsteps in the hall above. Ferrier forgot to lock the front door, whispered Pete. This may get more interesting. Jupiter got up and went to the top of the cellar stairs, where he pressed his ear against the door. He heard very faintly a murmur of voices. He held up two fingers to indicate that two more searchers were among them. The two men came down the hallway almost as far as the kitchen, and then went back again. There were more footsteps on the stairs above, and then a shout, and then a crack. That was a shot, said Jupiter. There was no more shouting, but rumbling voices came muffled to the Dobsons and the investigators as they waited in the cellar. There were more footsteps on the stairs. Someone stumbled, and then the searchers came into the kitchen and a chair scraped. You will sit quietly and you will not move, said the voice of General Kalokhe. Jupiter backed a step or two away from the cellar door. The door swung open, and the bulky figure of the Lepathian general filled the doorway. So, said the general, my young friend Jones and Master Andrews, you will come up, please, all of you. The three investigators and the Dobsons came up into the kitchen. The ceiling light was on, and Eloise Dobson gasped at the sight of Ferrier, the jaunty fisherman, sitting in one of the potter's straight chairs, pressing a handkerchief against his right wrist. A splash of red showed on his smart white jacket. The sight of blood upsets Madame, asked General Kalokhe. Do not be alarmed. The man is not badly hurt. He placed a chair for Miss Dobson and indicated that she should sit down. I do not approve of violence unless it is necessary, he told her. I fired upon this intruder only to prevent his firing upon me. Miss Dobson sat down. I think we should call the police, she said shakily. Tom, there's a call box on the highway. Tom, why don't you... General Kalokhe waved her to silence, and the younger Lepathian Dmitriev went to stand in the kitchen doorway. He held a gun, an efficient-looking revolver. I think, madame, that we may dismiss this person as being of no importance, said General Kalokhe, nodding toward the wretched farrier. I was not aware that he was in the area, or I would have taken steps to see that he did not annoy you. You sound like old friends, prompted Jupiter. Or shall I say, old enemies? The general laughed a short, ugly laugh. Enemies. This creature is not important enough to be an enemy. He is a criminal, an ordinary criminal, a thief. The general placed a chair for himself and sat down. You see, madame, it is my business to know these things. Among my other duties in Lapatia, I supervise the national police. There is a dossier on this person. He calls himself by many names. Smith, Farrier, Taliaferro. It's all the same. He steals jewels. You will agree. You will agree, madam, that this is a wicked thing to do. Oh, it's dreadful, said Eloise Dobson quickly. But there are no jewels in this house. What did he... Wait, why are you here? We saw from our terrace, madam, that this wicked person seemed to be interfering with you and my young friends. So naturally, we came to your assistance. Oh, thank you, said Mrs. Dobson. She bounced up from her chair. Thank you so much. Now we can call the police and... All in good time, madame. Will you please sit down? Mrs. Dobson sat down. I've neglected to introduce myself, said the general. I am Claes Kalokhe. And you, madame? I am Eloise Dobson, Mrs. Thomas Dobson, and this is my son, Tom. And you are a friend of Alexis Karenov. Mrs. Dobson shook her head. I've never heard of him. Well, he is called the Potter, said General Kalokhe. Oh, of course. Mrs. Dobson's a friend of Mr. Potter, said Jupiter quickly. From the Midwest. I told you that. The general scowled at Jupiter. Allow madame to answer for herself, if you please, he ordered. He turned back to Mrs. Dobson. You are a friend of the man who is known as the Potter. Eloise Dobson looked aside. She had a wary look of an unskilled swimmer who suddenly finds herself in very deep water. Yes, she said softly, her face colored. General Kalokhe smiled. I think Madame is not telling me the whole truth, he said. Bear in mind, if you please, that I am an expert at this sort of game. Now, perhaps, Madame, would you care to tell me how she met the person known as Mr. Potter? Well, said Mrs. Dobson, by the letter. You see, we wrote, and the Potter does a big mail order business, said Pete quickly. Yeah, said Bob, and he mailed stuff to Miss Dobson, and she wrote one thing, and one thing led to another. Stop it, the general shouted to Bob. What nonsense! Do you expect me to believe that? This woman writes letters to an old man who makes pots, and what they have to do write to one another is so interesting that she comes to this small village and moves into this house, and on the day he vanishes, I am not a fool. Don't shout, cried Eloise Dobson. She was shouting herself. You have some nerve barging in here, and I don't care if this farrier swiped the royal crown of England. We need to get a doctor for him. He's bleeding all over the floor." The general glanced at Farrier and at 2 drops of blood which had dripped on the floor. Madame is too soft-hearted," he said to Miss Dobson. "We will attend to Mr. Farrier when we are ready. Now, you will tell me how you became acquainted with Mr. Porter."
"Well, it's none of your darn business," cried Miss Dobson. "But if you have to know—"
"Miss Dobson, I wouldn't," pleaded Jupiter.
"He's my father," finished Mrs. Dobson triumphantly. "He's my father, and this is his house, and you have no business here, and don't you dare—"
The general threw his head back and laughed heartily.
"It isn't funny," snapped Miss Dobson.
"Oh, but it is," chortled the general. He looked up at the younger Lepathian, who stood in the doorway. "Dmitriev, we have a real prize. We have the daughter of Alexis Karenov." The general leaned towards Miss Dobson. "Now, you will tell me what I wish to learn, and then we will attend to Mr. Farrier, who is such a worry to you." What is it that you want us to learn?" said Mrs. Dobson. "There is a certain piece of property, a thing of great value, which belongs to my people," said the general. "You know that to which I refer?" Eloise Dobson shook her head. "She doesn't know," said Jupiter Jones urgently. "She doesn't know anything. Nothing about Lepathia, nothing at all." "Hold your tongue," snapped the general. "Madame Dobson, I am waiting." I don't know," said Eloise.
"Jupiter is right. I don't know anything. I never heard of any Alexis Karenov. My father is Alexander Porter."
"And he did not entrust you with the secret?" demanded the general.
"Secret? What secret?"
cried Miss Dobson. "Ridiculous!" snorted the general. "He must have told you. It was his duty. And you will tell me now."
"But I don't know anything," cried Mrs. Dobson.
"Dmitriev!" shouted the general, losing his iron control. "She will talk." Dmitriev started towards Miss Dobson.
"Hey!" yelled Tom. "Don't you touch my mother!"
Dmitriev shoved Tom roughly aside. "Into the cellar with them," ordered General Kalokhe. "All of them, except this obstinate woman."
No, you don't," yelled
Pete. He and Bob lunged themselves at the younger man, Pete going for Dmitriev's gun, and Bob headed in a beautiful tackle at the man's legs. Dmitriev went down with a loud grunt, and the gun blasted harmlessly toward the ceiling. That shot was followed by a second thunderous roar. The back door had burst open, and the Potter stood there, an ancient and somewhat rusty shotgun in his hand. "Don't move!" shouted the Potter. Jupiter froze halfway between the cellar door and the chair where General Kalokhe sat. The general remained where he was, and Pete and Bob sprawled on the floor on top of the fallen Dmitriev.
"Grandfather?"
said Tom Dobson. "Good evening, Tom," said the Potter. "Eloise, my dear, I'm sorry about all this." General Kalokhe started to get up. The shotgun which the Potter held instantly swung in his direction. "Do not move, Kalokhe," said the Potter. "There is a second shell in this gun, and it would give me great pleasure to discharge it right in your face." The general sat down again. "Jupiter, my boy," said the Potter, "will you please collect the guns? From the general's friend on the floor, of course, and I am sure the general has one someplace. The general has always been fond of guns." "Yes, Mr. Potter," said Jupiter. "I mean, Mr. Karenov." Chapter 18. The Bargain. No one spoke until Jupiter Jones had taken Demetrius' revolver and had searched General Kalokhe and relieved him of Ferrier's blunt automatic and a smaller but still deadly pistol. "Lock the guns in the pantry, Jupiter, and bring me the key," said the potter. Jupiter did so. The potter tucked the key into a pocket hidden somewhere in his robe and allowed himself to relax a bit, leaning against the cupboard. Only then did Eloise Dobson begin to cry. Now, my dear," said the potter, "it's all over. I have been watching these scoundrels the entire time. I would never have let them touch a hair of your head." Mrs. Dobson got up and went to the potter. He handed his shotgun to Jupiter and put his arms around her. I know, he said. He laughed and held her away from him so that she could not help but see his hair, his beard, and the robe, now soiled and stained. "Yes, I am a shock to you, eh?" he said. "No one has a father like Alexander Potter." Mrs. Dobson nodded, and then shook her head, and then burst into new tears. General Kalokhe said something in that strange sing-song language which Jupiter and Bob had heard at Hilltop House. "I must ask you to speak English," said the potter to him. "It's so many years since I heard my daughter's tongue, my mother tongue, that I am no longer proficient in it." "Astonishing," exclaimed the general. "And who is that?" said the potter, indicating the unfortunate Mr. Ferrier, who still crouched in his chair, holding his injured wrist. "It's a person of no importance," said the general. "A common thief." "His name is Mr. Ferrier, grandfather," said Tom Dobson. "Jupe thinks he's the one who's been trying to scare us out of the house." "Scare you? How?" "On 3 separate occasions," said Jupiter Jones, "flaming footprints have appeared in the house. You'll notice 3 footprints near the pantry and 2 near the cellar door. And there's a 3rd set on the stairs." "Ho, said the potter. "Flaming footprints! I see you've done your homework, Mr. Ferrier, and learned about our family ghost. Jupiter, why is this man bleeding?" "General Kalokhe shot him." "Ah, I see. And do I understand correctly that this person has been entering the house and trying to frighten my family?" "You'll never prove it," growled Ferrier. "He has your extra set of keys," said Jupiter. "I believe we should summon Chief Reynolds," announced the potter. "My dear Eloise, I had no idea. I was so concerned lest Kalokhe might do you some harm that I neglected to keep a proper watch on my own house." The general looked at the potter with some awe. "Do I understand correctly, Alexis, that you have been watching me?" "I have been watching you, and you have been watching my daughter. May I ask, old friend, where have you been these 3 days?" There is a loft at the top of the garage of the Hilltop House," said the potter simply. "The garage doors are locked, but there's a window on the north side."
"Ah, I see," said the general. "I fear I'm getting careless in my old age."
"Exceedingly," said the potter. "And now, Jupiter, let us call Chief Reynolds and have these people removed from my house."
"One moment, Alexis," said the general. "There is a matter of some jewels which were removed from their rightful owners many years ago."
"Yeah, and the rightful owners of the Asimovs," countered the potter. "It is my duty to safeguard those jewels."
"The rightful owners are the people of Lapatia," said the general. "The Asimovs are gone."
"You lie," flared the potter. "Nicholas did not die in that place at Madanoff. We fled together. We were to meet in America. It was arranged. I had a way to send a message to him. I have been waiting."
"Poor Alexis," said the general. "You have waited a lifetime, and for nothing. Nicholas did not even reach the railroad station. He was recognized." The general reached into an inside pocket
and produced a photograph. He handed it to the potter. The potter looked at the thing for almost a minute. Then, "Murderer!" he said to the Lapathian general. The general took back the photograph.
"It was not my choice," he told the potter. "His Highness was my friend, remember?"
"Oh, and so you use your friends?" asked the potter.
"It could not be helped," said the general. "There may be a justice in it, we cannot say. The Asimovs began in blood, they ended in blood. But Alexis, they did end. And what of you? You have spent a lifetime waiting behind locked doors, hiding behind a beard and a robe of an eccentric, living without your family. You did not see your daughter grow up, I assume."
The potter shook his head.
"For a crown," said the general. "All of this you have done for a crown which no one can wear."
"What do you want?" asked the potter at last.
"I wish to take it back with me to Madanov," said the general. "It will be put into the National Museum there. That's where it belongs, and that's where the people wish to see it. It is what the general promised them long ago."
"That promise was a mockery," cried the potter.
I know. I myself did not approve, but Lubatsky insisted. And once the gesture had been made, we had to go on with it. Anything else would have shaken the faith of the people."
"Liars!" stormed the potter. "Murderers! How dare you talk about the faith of the people?"
"I am an old man now, Alexis," said the general. "And you are old too. And the people of Lapathia are happy. I promise you, they are happy. How much love was there for the Asimovs? And now the Asimovs are gone. And what will you accomplish if you refuse me? Would you make yourself a thief? I cannot believe it. You have the crown. You swore you would always have it. That is why I came. Give it to me, Alexis, and let us part friends."
"Never friends," said the potter.
"Well, then at least let us not part enemies," pleaded the general. "Let us consider what will be the greater good for all, and let us forget the price we have both paid."
The potter was silent.
"You cannot claim it for yourself," said the general. "Alexis, you have no choice. There is no place it can go but to Madanov. And think, what would be the consequences to yourself if it were known that it is in your possession? And what would be the consequences to Lapathia? I do not know, but I can imagine distrust, unrest, perhaps a revolution. Would you wish another revolution, Alexis?"
The potter shuddered. "Very well. I will get it for you."
"It is here now?" asked General Kalokhe.
"It's here," said the potter. "Just a moment." "Mr. Potter," said Jupiter Jones. "Yes, Jupiter." "Shall I get it?" asked Jupe. "It's in the urn, isn't it?" "You are a clever boy, Jupiter. It is in the urn. Will you get it?" Jupe left the room and was gone for perhaps a minute, during which time no one spoke. When Jupiter returned, he was carrying a bulky bundle. Layers of soft cloth had been wrapped around an object which Jupiter put down on the table. "You can open it," said the potter. General Kalokhe nodded in agreement.
"I am sure you are curious," he said.
Jupiter undid the wrappings and folded back the cloth. There, exposed on the potter's kitchen table, was a magnificent crown of gold and lapis lazuli, surrounded by a huge ruby, with a crimson eagle screaming from both sharp-pointed enameled beaks. "The imperial crown of Lapathia!" exclaimed Bob. But I thought it was in the museum at Madanov," said Pete. The general stood up and looked at the marvelous object almost with reverence. "The one in Madanoff is a copy," he said. "It is a clever copy, although it was executed without help of a Karanov. I suppose there are a few experts like this Farrier person, who may have guessed at the truth. But the secret has been well kept. The crown is always under glass, of course, and the barriers which protect it are set well back from the case. No one can look too closely at it. Not too long ago, a photographer even received permission to include it in his book. He was an expert on photography, not jewels, so he granted his request." The general began to restore the wrappings to the crown. "The secret will still be kept," he said, "but the crown in Madanoff will be the real one." "How can you be so sure your secret will be kept?" said the surly farrier. "You've only got a score or two of witnesses here." "Who will believe you?" said the general. "You may talk all you wish." He took the crown and held out his hand to the potter. The potter turned away. "Very well, Alexis," said the general. "We will not meet again. I wish you happiness." And the general went out, followed by the slim, unsmiling Mr. Dmitriev. "Jupiter," said the potter, "I think that now you may summon the police." Chapter 19. It would make a great movie. A week later, Mr. Alfred Hitchcock, the famous movie producer and director, sat in his office and leafed through some of the notes which Bob had compiled on the potter and his wonderful secret. "So the crown was hidden in the urn," said Mr. Hitchcock, "outside the potter's shop, where hundreds of people came and went every week. That scoundrel farrier must have passed it down dozens of times when he was working so hard to frighten Mrs. Dobson away." He told us that he tried to open the urn," said Jupiter Jones. "Of course, he did most of his mischief at night, so he didn't have time or light to examine the urn with care and notice the single-headed eagle looking to the left. The top of the urn came off when you turned it clockwise, to the left. All ordinary containers open the other way. That was the signal which the potter and the Grand Duke agreed upon when they fled from the palace. If anything happened to the potter, the Grand Duke Nicholas was to look for a single-headed eagle among a group of double-headed eagles of Lapathia, and the eagle would be the clue to the whereabouts of the crown." "And the potter was planning to take up ceramics even before revolution in Lapathia?" asked Mr. Hitchcock. "No," said Bob, who was perched in a chair next to Jupiter Jones. "He became a potter because he had to make a living. But he could have found a number of ways of creating eagles. He could have painted them or stenciled them on a wall or hey, there's always embroidery," put in Pete, who occupied the chair on Jupiter's left side. "I am sure a scarlet eagle would be most effective in cross-stitch," said Mr. Hitchcock. "Now, about this Mr. Farrier. Your report states that he was arrested by Chief Reynolds on charges of unlawful entry and malicious mischief. I should not think that they could hold him long. Will he keep the secret of the crown, do you suppose?" "Well, he has everything to gain and nothing to lose by keeping his mouth shut," said Jupiter Jones. "Unlawful entry and malicious mischief are minor charges compared to attempted grand larceny. He's in jail in Rocky Beach now, pondering on his sins, which are more numerous than we suspected at first. All those elegant clothes were purchased with a credit card which he found in a wallet that someone had dropped on the street. I'm not certain what the charge is for the unauthorized use of a credit card, but I should think forgery would enter into it." "At least," agreed Mr. Hitchcock. "His car was so shabby," said Jupiter. "It bothered me. It didn't match. He's not even going to be able to pay Miss Hopper for the room he occupied at the Seabreeze Inn. The Potter says he feels responsible, so he's taking care of that bill.
Most generous, said Mr. Hitchcock.
Chief Reynolds found the stuff Ferrier used to create the flaming footprints at the bottom of Ferrier's car, which was parked up the highway, and never out of sight of the house, said Bob. Whatever it was, he says we'll never know. He thinks it's a good idea not to spread some kinds of information around.
The man is not without an imagination.
Ferrier? No, he has quite a record, and he has done some time in the best prisons. He used to be a crack jewels thief. According to Chief Reynolds, he got too well known. People everywhere started putting tails on him the second he showed up in any town. Cramped his style. He's been trying to make a living running for a little hobby shop in Los Angeles.
So, it was the article in Wesley's that brought him to Rocky Beach, said Mr. Hitchcock.
No, said Jupiter Jones. He told us how he got his first clue to the whereabouts of the crown while we were waiting for Chief Reynolds to come out and collect him. He always reads the personal ads of the Los Angeles Times. He suspected, as did a number of experts on such things, that the crown on display at Madanoff was an imitation. He had done some research on the history of Lepathia and knew about the disappearance of an Alexis Karenov, who was the hereditary guardian of the crown. When he saw the advertisement in the Times with the names Alexis and Nicholas, he remembered the Grand Duke Nicholas, who was supposed to have hanged himself during the Revolution, and he wondered if it might not have something to do with the crown. He went to the trouble of buying papers from Chicago and New York on a hunch, and he found identical advertisements in them. Then he came to Rocky Beach on a quick visit, and he wandered into the Potter's shop one bright afternoon and
saw the medallion with the eagle, finished Mr. Hitchcock. Is that the one thing I don't understand? Why did Karenov insist on wearing that medallion?
He admits it was foolish, said Jupiter. He felt lonely, perhaps, and it may have reminded him of better times. Also, he felt there was a little chance of anyone from Lepathia appearing in Rocky Beach unless they were summoned, and his advertisement, which he placed annually on all the major papers in the United States, was addressed to Nicholas. He felt only Nicholas would understand it. It was part of the agreement which they had made when they fled together from the palace at Madanoff. They would separate, and both would try to make their way to the States. Alexis would advertise once a year, and on the anniversary of the Revolution, until Nicholas found him. And if anything happened to Alexis before Nicholas found him, Nicholas could always examine the files of back editions of various newspapers and would at least know in which town Alexis had settled. And then to look for the odd eagle with the single head.
It's a very involved scheme, said Mr. Hitchcock, and one that's left a great deal to chance. However, I suppose they did not have a great deal of time to work out anything more practical with the revolution going on around them. So, for a lifetime, Alexis waited.
And Nicholas never escaped.
What was the photograph which the Lepathian general showed the Potter? Asked Mr. Hitchcock.
He wouldn't tell us, said Pete. It was something gruesome. And proving Nicholas was dead, no doubt, added Jupiter.
It must have been a great shock to the Potter, said Mr. Hitchcock. On the other hand, he must have begun to suspect that his vigil was in vain. So many years had passed.
And I guess he hoped right to the end that Nicholas would show up and the Asimovs would be restored to their throne, said Bob. in which case, chuckled Pete, the Potter would be the Duke of Malambad, and Mrs. Thomas Dobson of Bellevue, Illinois, would eventually get to be a duchess. I wonder how Mrs. Dobson would enjoy being a duchess.
Has she forgiven her father? Asked Mr. Hitchcock.
Yes, said Bob. And she's still there, and she's helping him in the shop. She is young, and Tom will stay until the end of summer, and the Lepathians have departed. They left the minute they got their hands on the crown, Jupiter reported. We have to rely on guesswork with the men from Lepathia. We can only assume that the Westways article led them to the Potter. I think that they rented Hilltop House planning to wage some sort of war of nerves on the Potter. It upset them greatly when he disappeared, and a young woman and a boy moved into his house. But they kept watching and waiting until they saw Farrier make his move out there in the Potter's yard. And then they came scrambling down the hill to make sure no one got the crown before they did. General Kalokhe, I'm sure, was sent to Rocky Beach because he had once known Alexis Karenov and might be better able to recognize him than Dmitriev, who had never known him personally, surmised Alfred Hitchcock. And he did recognize him, said Jupiter. In spite of all the beard and the white hair, the Potter had not changed that much, and Kalokhe had changed barely at all. It would make a great movie, don't you think, Mr. Hitchcock? Pete said, I mean, flaming footprints, and a family ghost, and an innocent daughter who doesn't know anything what the score is, and stolen jewels? It has some points to recommend it, said Mr. Hitchcock. There are still one or two things you have not explained in your report, however. The sound of running water in the pipes in the Potter's house when all the taps were off. That was the Potter using the outside tap, said Jupiter. He could not hide out in that old garage without water, and since the Lepathians never left Hilltop House, he couldn't get water there, and he had come down to his house at night. He didn't want to reveal himself to Mrs. Dobson, however, because he felt that the less she knew, the better off she would be. The Lepathians could not see him at the tap, even in moonlight, because of the thick hedge of oleanders behind the house. It was for that reason that they could not see Farrier, who entered and left by the back door. How did Farrier get into the house to get the keys? Asked Mr. Hitchcock. That was ironical, said Jupiter Jones. The Potter was apparently so preoccupied with preparations for the Dobsons that once he neglected to lock up tight, Mr. Farrier claimed he had no trouble getting in through the front door, only had to pick one lock, and he told Chief Reynolds he was just curious about the house, and that later, when Mrs. Dobson snubbed him, he grew angry and tried to frighten her with the flaming footprints. And the chief of Rocky Beach believed him? Said Mr. Hitchcock with some astonishment. Well, not at all, but no one has come up with a better story, so he has to take what he can get. One other detail, said Mr. Hitchcock. You were fired upon when you came down from Hilltop House. Was that Farrier? No, said Bob. It was the Potter again. He apologized. He wanted to scare us off since he left the men at Hilltop House were dangerous. He had had that shotgun stored in the shack where he kept supplies, so he had no trouble getting his hands on it when he wanted it. What do you think? Insisted Pete. Wouldn't it make a great movie, Mr. Hitchcock? Mr. Hitchcock sniffled. No love interests. Oh, said Pete. However, said Mr. Hitchcock, Alexis Karenov, the Duke of Malambad, has been reunited with his daughter, so at least we do have a happy ending. She's a great cook, said Jupiter. And the Potter's putting on weight. He went into Los Angeles and bought a suit of clothes and some shoes. He's going back to Bellevue with Mrs. Dobson in the autumn to meet his son-in-law, and he doesn't want his daughter's friends to think he's a nut, put in Pete. Eccentric, said Jupe. He paused. Which he certainly is. The end. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this reading of The Three Investigators and the Mystery of the Flaming Footprints. I think it was a pretty good story. It's not my favorite, but at least it can get us started into seeing other stories that are fun to read, like mysteries and suspense. Those stories are always fun. The Three Investigators have a whole series of books that I'm going to try to get more of. And maybe we'll read another one later. Okay, everybody. I will talk to you later.
Bye.